Welcome to part 8 of our study series through the book of Romans. And today we're looking at the second half of chapter 3. Now, way back in chapter 1, the Apostle Paul made an incredible announcement of a revelation from God on the entire human race. And so Romans 1:18, he writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." And then for 2 chapters, Paul proceeds to make the case that all are guilty before God. And Paul declares that no one living at any time, under any circumstances, is ignorant. Because as we discussed in our previous sessions, all people have received 2 gracious manifestations of the revelation from God. Firstly, there's general revelation, which is God's revelation of himself through the created order, which everybody has that. All people everywhere have general revelation. And then there's also the internal revelation that God has given to all people. God has wrote his law on our heart. And the response of the human race to this gracious revelation is universal suppression. So the fallen heart takes this knowledge, pushes it down, pushes it to the side, out of mind, twists it, distorts it into some form of idolatry. Others are even more culpable because in addition to general and internal revelation, they have received special revelation. They have the Bible. And what's the response of that group of people? Universal violation. That is, those who have special revelation have in word, action, or in their heart knowingly violated the revealed will of God. And so the human race, when brought before the law of God, fails that standard. Remember, the law is not grace. The law always requires perfection, and all have fallen short of that. And so Romans 3:10 says, this is the verdict that God has issued on humanity. There is none righteous, no, not one. And so in our last session, we reached the conclusion of Paul's bad news. Romans 3:19, that every mouth may be stopped and all the world may become guilty before God. And then he says in Romans 3:20, therefore by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. Now, if we stop right there, if we close the book of Romans, if that were the end of the matter, we would be totally without hope. But in today's study, we finally come to the but now. That is, however, yes, this is all bad, but now there's good news because there is a righteousness from God apart from law that has been revealed. And so let's look at that. Beginning in verse 21. But now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ, to all and on all who believe. For there's no difference. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood through faith, to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works? No, but by the law of faith. Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law. Or is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also, since there is one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. Do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. So this is the word of the Lord to us. And so let's just dig right in and start unpacking this. So firstly, verse 21, reread, but now, meaning Yeah, I know, I just told you a lot of bad news, but now, however, here's the good news. I just told you back in chapter 3, verse 20, by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified. So there is no possibility that you can get to heaven by your law keeping, by your good deeds, by keeping the 10 commandments. Because as we have seen, no one's kept that standard. But now, a righteousness from God apart from the law is revealed. And so he returns to his original thesis statement from way back in the opening chapter 1. And so this is the gospel, a righteousness from God apart from law. So no one will be justified or made righteous in God's eyes through law keeping. But there's another way that is apart from law keeping. And so he says, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. And so Paul makes a quick parenthetical statement that says, this is actually not a new way of salvation. Now, it's more clearly revealed in the New Testament. That's new. But this was present all along in the Old Testament. Okay, tell us, Paul, this righteousness of God, tell us about this other way to be right with God that is not by our law keeping. He says it comes not by works, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And just in case we didn't get that, it is all by faith alone. He says it again, who believe. And then he says, for there is no difference. No difference in what? No difference between Jew or Gentile, male or female, whether you have SR or special revelation or not. This righteousness is given to all and on all who believe. And here's why this way to get to God doesn't matter who you are. It's because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so I want you to imagine this line is the standard of righteous living that we would have to achieve in order to be righteous in God's sight. And so some people rise higher than others, but it doesn't matter because all have fallen short. Or think about it like this. Imagine a bridge is out and two guys decide that they can just leap across, and one jumps and he gets halfway and falls, and the other guy, he gets 75% of the way and he falls. But does it matter that one went further than the other? Well, I don't think so. They both fall short. And so all of us have fallen short of being right with God through our own moral effort. And so the gospel involves justification by grace. That's what verse 24 says. Now, we keep seeing that word, justified. Very important word. It means to have a right standing with God. So that when God looks at you, it's just as if I had never sinned. And how do sinners achieve that? In the gospel, it is a status that is given freely by his grace. Now, sometimes in the church, we say these words so often, it becomes the church talk. And it's good to pause from time to time and remind ourselves what these words mean. Grace. What is grace? Grace is God's unmerited favor. You can't work for this. You can't, by definition, deserve this. It's a free gift. But how can all of this be just? If you've been listening carefully, you should be thinking, wait a minute, Paul, I thought you said God is a God of righteousness, and you're saying he lets guilty people off the hook. They get off scot-free just by believing on Jesus? If an earthly judge let guilty people go, we would have a real problem with that. Well, here in verse 25, we see how God does that justly. It says, whom God set forth. So God is presenting Jesus. He's setting Jesus forth to the world as a propitiation. What's that? A satisfactory payment for some wrong that has been done. And what is that payment? By his blood. So God is not just letting it slide. He's not ignoring the wrongs that have been done by us and others. It's being punished. It's being paid for, just not by you, but by him. And you connect to that through faith. And so God presents Jesus as a propitiation for sins, not only so that he can justify him forgiving guilty people, but it says here as a demonstration of the righteousness of God. How so, Paul? Because in his forbearance, God had passed over the sins that were previously committed. What's he talking about? Well, prior to the cross, all throughout the period of the Old Testament, there were all these people that God had justified. Guys like Abraham and Moses and Aaron and David and countless others that we don't even know their names. And they're all lawbreakers. Abraham was a liar, and Moses was a murderer, and David was an adulterer, and yet God forgave all these people their sins. And yet, at that time, there was no propitiation. No payment had been made for all these transgressions. And so all the time, it's as if there was a shadow hanging over the justice of God. It seemed that God was just letting sin slide until the cross. The cross was the demonstration of his righteousness. At the cross, God punished all those past sins that he had forgiven by letting that wrath fall on Jesus. And so at the cross, God was saying, I take sin seriously. So in verse 25, we see how the cross vindicates God's righteousness for sins that he had forgiven in the past to demonstrate his righteousness because in his forbearance, God had passed over the sins that were previously committed. And then in verse 26, God is vindicated at the cross for all the present and future sins that he forgives, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness. And so either way, God is vindicated at the cross. The point is this: no matter when in history it takes place, every sin is still condemned, even when God forgives. And so no sin at any time in history is overlooked by the justice of God. For those who are outside of Christ, their sins are condemned in hell. For those who are in Christ, their sins are condemned at the cross. But all sin, even forgiven sin, will face the justice of God. And that is why it's possible for God to be, as it says in verse 26, just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Christ. You see, in the gospel, God has made a way that he can justify guilty people and remain just in doing that. Praise be to his name. So in the gospel, all bragging rights are removed. Verse 27 says, where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works? No, but by the law of faith. So this verse is asking, which way of getting to heaven removes all credit from us? Law keeping or justification by faith? Of course, if we could get to heaven by our law keeping, we would have something to brag about. But if by grace we are justified by faith in Christ apart from our law keeping, then all boasting is excluded. And so it says in verse 28, therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law. And so it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile, we are justified by faith. Verse 29, or is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also. Since there's one God who will justify the circumcised, the Jew, by faith, and the uncircumcised, the Gentile, through faith. Now, does all of this make the gospel some sort of legal loophole? I mean, do we make void the law through faith? Verse 31a asks. Certainly not. Verse 31, on the contrary, we establish the law. The law is not bypassed through the gospel. At the cross, every sin of those justified in Christ meets the law's demands. In the gospel, God is just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus.